Hi, this is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. One of the things we have to be very careful of is a couple of things. One in particular is social engineering, and I see a lot of social engineering that is occurring in the country, and so I want to go back a little bit. But part of the problem is a lot of times when we're trying to figure things out, someone like myself who's a student of history, I don't limit myself to history, to the more recent history, but you really have to go back in order to fully understand something. You have to go back to its origins. It's like the Bible. The Bible is as a pastor, is what I rely on for doctrine, for my ideology, for my belief, and all that other stuff. And one of the most glaring things about the Bible is it lays a foundation. So the first book of the Bible is the book of Genesis, and it's the foundation or the origins of things. And so, and that happened a long time ago. So when we try to understand things, even spiritually, even from the New Testament, we can't just look at recent occurrences. We can't look at recent history. We have to really go back to the origins or the genesis of something in order for us to fully understand what we're dealing with. And when we don't do that, we really miss. We only get part of the story. It would be like if you walked into a movie. If you didn't see the very beginning of the movie and you came in halfway through the movie, you wouldn't get a clear depiction as to what is going on. You may try to what was occurring. And so I'm going to take us back a little bit and talk about what's happening and occurring here and now in 2020, so that we don't fall victim to the same kind of manipulation, if you will. So anyway, if you look at the history of the world, especially, there's always been a ruling elite class or an elite class of people, right? Whether it's because of wealth, it's primarily because of wealth, but you have wealth, political power. You have people that were considered, when you look at Plato's Republic, you had this ruling class. You always had a ruling class. And then they had people that helped to promote the ideals of ruling class. There's some of the ancient Greeks talk about the basically the king philosopher, right? So that's the ruling class, is a type of a king philosopher. I'm not going to labor that point a lot, but you need to understand the type of people that we call the ruling elite, right? I call them globalists, the New World Order, whatever the case may be. There's always been those people in power. And for the most part, after the Industrial Revolution, they began to kind of study how to control the masses. Because what happens, you had the old ancient feudal system. The quality of life, especially in Europe, wasn't that great. And so people's life expectancy was very short. So now you had the Industrial Revolution that occurred. And after the Industrial Revolution, not only did the quality of life of people began to increase, people started to live longer. You had what was called the feudal system. People couldn't generate wealth. People were basically like serfs or servants to the ruling class. But now you have the Industrial Revolution. You have this creation of what is known now as the middle class, where people became property owners. They live longer, higher quality of life. You have this idea of these cities or urban areas developing. You have the population explosion. People start to live longer. It makes it more difficult to control the masses when there's a much larger amount of people, and B, the people are in more control of their own destiny. And so because of that, the ruling elite class began to kind of study how to control the masses, how to manipulate the masses. If you've been following some of my teaching, some from a historical, spiritual standpoint, because the Bible talks about this, it talks about the we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but people leave out the point that it talks about despotism in high places. The rulers of darkness in this present age, right? It's talking about that ruling elite class that began to believe that they have the authority and the right to rule over humanity. And that exists, right? It's there. It's not something that's made up or created. Of course, they would make you to believe that it doesn't really exist, but it does. If you can read some of their publications, if you read some of the philosophers, the ancient Greeks and different people like that, they kind of talk about these type of things. But anyway, you have this idea of how do you control masses of people, right? So modern psychology, which originated primarily in Germany and in Europe, people began to study how the human brain works, and you had people like Carl Jung, you had Freud, you had some of these people that began the study of psychology. But for the most part, they didn't study psychology just simply to know how the human brain works, but how do you control people? You have like a B.F. Skinner who, you had some of these things called operant conditioning and different things like that. Maslow, you had all these philosophers that began to study how the brain works and also try to understand how people respond to stimulus. Right, you have the whole thing about the dog that every time they rang a bell, they would feed the dog, and so they recognize reward response. So these are all things that they incorporated in how to kind of rule over the masses. So anyway, a couple of things that came out of that. In Germany, you had a couple of think tanks. You had the Frankfurt School. You had in Europe, and also in Europe, you had the Tavistock Institute. You had these think tanks that they spent a lot of money and resources on how and learning how they could social engineer the masses. And just to give you a definition, excuse me, social engineering, the use of a centralized planning in an attempt to manage social change and to regulate the future development and behavior of a society. So what social engineering is a process, a centralized process that the ruling class began to learn and to understand how to shape public opinion, basically, for lack of better terms, and to manage social change. And so a lot of the things that you begin to see when social engineering is at work is not people just organically coming to solutions, but they start to study how they can shift the public opinion and move the public into the direction they want to. Robert Hegel was one of them. And you hear this idea called the Hegelian dialectic. You hear me use that term a lot, which is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It means that they control both sides of the issue to a certain degree, and they're able to move the public into a preconceived destination, right? Also, a crisis, creating a crisis, and they already have the answer or the response already created, right? This is some of the things that these philosophers began to develop. If you get a chance, look up Hegelian dialectic, Robert Hegel, look at some of the other psychologists, B.F. Skinner, and some of these other people that began to develop how do you control the masses? How do you get the masses to accept what you want them to accept, but to give them the idea that they did it on their own, right? So that's what happens in America. One of the things that we see, especially in Germany, when they began to perfect the idea of propaganda. So you had Edward Bernays, who was the father of modern propaganda, which is advertising, public relations, all that stuff stems from that. And so with the use of propaganda, they began to use the media in order to shape public opinion, right? The media is one of the most powerful weapons that has ever been created in order to socially engineer the masses. Malcolm X gave a famous quote. He is so strong, it can make a guilty man seem innocent and an innocent man seem guilty, right? That's how powerful the media is. And when we're not sophisticated enough to see through that and understand what the media does, then we kind of accept what they're giving us as popular opinion. The whole idea of popular culture, we call it pop culture, was a creation of social engineering. So what they did when they came up with the term popular culture, they promote the idea that everybody accepts this, right? So some of these pop stars that you see come out of nowhere, they use social media to say that this must be popular. Their music must be good music. What they're saying must be right, because if everyone else is accepting it, then I have to fall in line. That's where you get the idea of groupthink. But anyway, let me move forward. So anyway, you have this idea of social engineering and popular culture, and especially now the media is doing that in regards to politics. So one of the first and most glaring examples of that is a thing called identity politics. And African Americans have been impacted the most through this concept of identity politics. So identity politics, I'll give you the definition. It's a tendency for people of a particular religion, race, social background, etc., to form exclusive political alliances, moving away from traditional broad-based party politics. And so the African American community has been affected the most through identity politics, especially in this day and time. Now, originally, African Americans all were Republicans, and it was for the right reason, right? Right after the Emancipation Proclamation and Black people having the right to vote, right? So you had the 14th and the 15th Amendment that not only gave them citizenship, but the right to vote. And so Black people voted Republican because the Republican Party was created as the anti-slavery party. So obviously, if I was an African American or a Black person, a freed slave, then naturally I would vote Republican because they were the party that helped to first election that Black people overwhelmingly affected was the election of Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Republican, obviously. Ulysses S. Grant won the election by 300,000 votes, and it was recorded that around 500,000 African American males voted for Ulysses S. Grant. And so if you took away the 500,000 votes of the African Americans, Ulysses S. Grant doesn't win the election. So the powers that be, again, the ruling elite period, right after, soon after that, they started to put obstacles in the way of Black people being able to vote. So they would do stuff like saying you had to own property in order to vote. You had to either pay a huge fee. And a lot of these people, especially freed slaves, right, they didn't have a lot of money. So if you put these big voting taxes on them, that was a thing to obstruct them to be able to vote. They also started, disproportionately affect African Americans because, obviously in 1865, before the Emancipation Proclamation fully was engaged after the Civil War, in the South, it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read. So now, soon after that, an obstacle against African Americans, right? So anyway, they were Republicans. There was a lot of obstructionists by the Southern Dixiecrats, right? They even created the Ku Klux Klan as the military arm of the Democratic Party. And what they would do is they would terrorize Blacks and white Republicans in a way to sway elections, right? So they would actually literally, the Ku Klux Klan would actually terrorize Black people, freed slaves, and white Republicans who were the elections. And so you saw the democratization of Black people voting, right? So fast forward it, in 1965, in 1964, you have the Civil Rights Act that permanently in 65 that guaranteed Black people the right to vote and to take away all these obstacles that that would hinder them from being able to vote. Right. So they saw these, they put laws and policies in place to keep that from happening, to hinder voter suppression. And so LBJ comes up with this brilliant idea because they understood that the became the swing vote. And so LBJ came up with this brilliant idea how to sway the Blacks to vote Democrats, right? And so if you look and get a chance, subscribe to my YouTube channel, look through some of my other talks that I did, and this is all I talk about the recordings in my library of him using the N-word, right? And how they wanted to use tests and polling taxes and those type of things in order to hinder African Americans from voting. So anyway, long story short, LBJ all of a sudden starts to support. He becomes president. He begins to support the Civil Rights Act, and so along with that, he started what was known as the War on Poverty, which is based on socialism, right? Socialism's ultimate goal is to encourage governmental dependency. So people will be dependent on the government and not families, which is why they have these huge social programs so that people go to the government for housing, for food, and for various other things, even healthcare, right? So it's set up that way. So they created the welfare system and the War on Poverty as a way not to help communities of color, but to make them more dependent on the government. And so LBJ is quoted in an unauthorized biography. They were confused. He was talking to some Southern Kentuckians in the mountains. I think it was Eastern Kentucky or somewhere around there. They were confused because they wondered why did he all of a sudden begin to put a lot of energy in supporting the Civil Rights Bill. And he recognized and mentioned, he says, with this legislation, we're going to promote these social programs, and we're going to give them something because now they have a lot of they have the right to vote, right? And he says that we're going to give them something, not enough to make a difference, but enough to make them vote Democrat for the next 200 years is what the quote is. He's quoted as saying. So anyway, now you start to see this slow swing from black people being Republicans to Democrats. And so with identity politics, with this idea of identity politics, the perception was that the Democrats were looking out for black people. And so black people overwhelmingly over the last couple of decades have supported Democrats. But what they didn't understand is that the reason that they implemented these social programs the way they did was not to help the black community, but to keep them dependent, which is why since the 1960s, the US government has spent about $22 trillion on the war against poverty, but yet the percentage of people that are on welfare has not moved a lot at all, very little. And with that being said, the black family unit is weaker, and other families, but especially the black family is weaker, even though we vote overwhelmingly Democrat, especially in the urban areas. So if you look at these areas that black people are the most challenged in, if you look at Chicago, if you look at Baltimore, if you look at Minneapolis, if you look at St. Louis, if you look at, I can go on and on, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., I could go on and on. All of these cities, Detroit, Michigan, are Democrat strongholds and have been Democrats for a long time, Los Angeles, California. But these are cities that the conditions for African Americans in the urban areas are the worst. But it's because there's a larger amount of governmental dependency. There's a breakdown of the family. You have weaker family units. You have more governmental dependencies. And along with the weakened family unit and more governmental dependencies, you see a trickle down effect with drugs, crime, lack of educational performance when you break down the family, especially when there's no fathers in the household. So anyway, you have this idea of identity politics, and I heard LeBron James and some other celebrities that recently are saying that they are doing the push to vote, right? Back in during the Obama administration, you had Puff Daddy and some of these other people that said vote or die, these kind of slogans. They were really pushing for voter participation. But the problem with that is on a local level, not on a national level as much, but on a local level, they're voting for the same people that have voted for throughout the decades, but yet the conditions are progressively worse. People don't realize this, but in the 1950s, Detroit had one of the highest standards of living in the country. The salaries, the income, all that stuff was really high in Detroit, which is why a lot of black people gravitated towards that, especially from the South. They gravitated there. I had relatives in Detroit because of the auto industry and different things like that. Remember, I mentioned the Industrial Revolution. And so because of that, they had high wages and different things of that nature. But now if you look at Detroit, Detroit is one of the worst places that has some of the worst conditions for people of color. And a lot of these people, a lot of these cities, they have the same pattern. And I found this pattern years ago, that you have failing schools, you have broken family units, you have high crime, high incarceration rates, and those type of things. And so we have to focus on why is it that we have identified with a party that we have stood with for over 50 years, but yet we still haven't, there's no upside, there's no benefit. And people will try to point to the national elections. The national elections don't have as much to do impact on your life as local elections do. So the mayor of your town, the governor of your state, right, the city council, those are people that have a greater impact on your life. And so that's the people you have to focus on more so than federal, because the local elections play a larger part. And if you look on a local level, all the major cities that have the worst conditions for black people all are Democrat. Now, I'm not telling you because I'm a Republican, because I'm not a Republican. I've never been a Republican. I was a Democrat for many years. I am now a political independent, because it is not political parties that help you. It is platforms and policies that help you. And so you have to focus on the platforms and the policies and not on the party, right? Because parties can switch, right? Parties change, but the policies are the things that either help or hurt your community, which is why we have to focus on that. So we talked about identity politics. And also one last thing I want to mention is this thing of political correctness. Political correctness is a tool that was created to not only socially engineer people, but to shape public opinion. What do I mean by that? See, what happens is when you have popular culture and you have political correctness, they tell you what you can say and what you can't say. And they begin to implement things such as If you say you don't support gay marriage, you're homophobic, right? Now, if you don't promote transgender rights, you're transphobic. If you say that you're pro-life, then they say that you're misogynistic or you're anti-woman. So that's part of political correctness that is used to social engineer people, because what it does is it shapes public opinion. So if you say you can't say something, then what it's saying subconsciously that's wrong, that your opinion that opposes that stance or that ideology is wrong, and ultimately it leads to acceptance of a certain political ideology, right? If you look at over 10 years ago, say 15 years ago, the majority of people voted, right, consistently every time they had a vote up until 2008. The majority of people voted to protect marriage between a man and a woman. But after President Obama came in office, he openly supported gay marriage. Public opinion has swayed. They begin to do a very good PR campaign to promote the idea that homosexuality is normal. And so now you have more people accepting it, because we have been socially engineered into accepting an age-old institution that from the beginning of time, we have accepted that marriage is between a man and a woman. So understand that that's the process. That's how they do things. You have to be very careful and not to get caught up in the propaganda. This whole thing with race. Now, the idea of race is really being social engineered, and there is agendas that's being they repeat it over and over again. And so one of the I think it was the gentleman from not Bernays, but it was the gentleman who was the head of the Nazi propaganda. They perfected propaganda during the Nazis, which is how they got the nation to go to war. They got people to accept the oppression of the Jews, and et cetera, by using propaganda. And one of the strategies that they said, Hitler was one of the ones who was in charge of the propaganda, but there was also a gentleman who was the Ministry of Propaganda there. And one of the things that they said is, if you repeat a lie long enough in the mainstream media, people accept it as truth. And that's what happens. People accept it. The media says things over and over again. They say it as a foregone conclusion. And ultimately, people begin to get shifted in their thinking, and they start to take it as face value, right? So if you oppose gay marriage, they'll say, oh, that's homophobic. And they said it so much that now people say, well, I don't want to be homophobic if I say that I'm not in support of gay marriage, right? If I say I'm pro-life, then they say, oh, you're trying. Those are things that they do. They repeat those things over and over again. And so because they keep repeating it over and over again, the popular opinion now is swayed to accept those opinions. And that's one of the strategies. With race, saying that America is a racist nation. And I will say to you, I've traveled, and I can say that, without any fear of contradiction, because I've been many other places. But they will tell you how horrible the conditions are in this country, and they'll say it over and over again. And they always point to racism, because racism is their main go-to thing. Anytime there is some negative interaction, a lot of times they will automatically default to racism, right? And that's one of the social engineering strategies that happen. And that one goes to tell you how far these strategies go back. The great Booker T. Washington, who is the founder of Tuskegee Institute, was a great African-American activist and leader. Here's what he said. There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public, having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles. They have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. That's the great Booker T. Washington. I'm going to leave you with that quote. Again, this has been Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church, located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement. And until then, peace and blessings to you.